When I was 6 years old, my sister died at home in a tragic accident. I was there. And it was the early 90s. There wasn't a lot of understanding about how kids understand death and experience grief. And because of that, it took a long time for the adults in my life to really understand what I was going through. And eventually it was recommended to them that they find age-appropriate resources to help me understand death and to help normalize the experience for me. But the thing is that there weren't a lot of really great resources. So I ended up being given books like Anne of Green Gables, The Secret Garden, The Little Princess, and I was also given this doll named Samantha, and she was an American Girl doll. And for those of you who don't know what an American Girl doll is, each one comes from a different time period, and they have a set of books that describe their life. So you have this doll, and then you have this book that describes their life. And Samantha was a Victorian orphan. And I'm sure the thought is that Rachel Ann has brown hair, Samantha has brown hair. Samantha has dead parents, and Rachel Ann has a dead sister. Samantha goes to school and doesn't lie to her friends and say there's dead people buried in the backyard. Hopefully Rachel Ann will stop doing that. So they gave me these books, and I become completely obsessed with Samantha, Anne of Green Gables, these stories. But instead of it normalizing death for me, it made me want to be a Victorian orphan. I wanted to be a Victorian orphan so bad. I pretended to be a Victorian orphan all the time. I played Victorian orphan. I put the shawl over my head, and I would go out and try to sleep in the neighborhood gazebo, because you can't be a Victorian orphan if you have parents. So I would abandon them to my Victorian orphan life. My best friend who lived in the neighborhood, Corey, I would call her up and I would try to persuade her to play Victorian orphan with me. And I would call her up and I'd say, hey, Corey, do you want to come over? And she goes, what are we going to do? And I'd be like, you know what we're going to do. And she goes, please don't make me pretend to have scarlet fever again. Because it's just so, it was just what I wanted. There's a picture of me with my siblings at a national park in the middle of July wearing a gray wool dress, black stocking and braids, just standing there. And I really appreciated that all my relatives just let me really lean into this live action role playing that I had done. And weirdly, it did help cope, because as you all know, when you have a passion, everything else makes sense. Years later, I would be getting my master's in fine arts at a university in the Midwest, and my area of focus was in print, book, and paper arts, and I developed a really intense affinity for Victorian-era printing presses. It's funny how our childhood interests somehow wander our way into adulthood. So I'm actually teaching a class, and I'm working on one of these Victorian-era printing presses, and the students' backs are facing me. So they're all sitting there, and they're getting their paper ready, and I'm working on this press, and they can't see me at the moment. And I'm leaning over the press, and all of a sudden, the pencil holding my hair up falls out, and my hair, in an instant, gets sucked into this machine. And in a moment, I grab my scalp, and I'm able to get the machine off, and my hair is just snapping as it gets sucked into the machine. And I'm able to get it off, and I'm able to walk out of there before they even realize what's happened, right? And, of course, thoughts of OSHA violations are going through my mind. And I get into the bathroom, and I'm looking in the mirror, and I'm doing that thing that happens when something really scary happens, where you go, what just happened? And you start to assess the damage, head, shoulders, knees, toes, is everything there? I'm looking at my hand, and I'm realizing in that split second, I knew to grab my scalp, to not grab my hair, because if I grabbed my hair, my hand would have gotten sucked into the machine and gotten mangled. And if I hadn't grabbed my scalp, I would have been scalped. It would have pulled my hair into the machine. And then I realized that the reason I knew exactly what to do was because Samantha, the Victorian orphan, had a friend named Nellie, but she didn't have rich grandparents, so she had to work as a child laborer in one of the Victorian factories. And Nellie could not express how important it was to be safe on these machines because kids were getting scalped all the time. And me and Corey would live action role play working in one of these factories over and over and over again. And somehow that moment in my childhood came to me and kept me from really hurting myself. Now, when I tell you this story, I'm not saying this because I'm not trying to say like everything happens for a reason. That there isn't this like, magic cosmic thing that happens where the tragedy of my sister's death led me to being obsessed with being a Victorian orphan, and somehow it connected to keeping me from getting mangled by a Victorian era printing press in, the middle of the Midwest in my late 20s. What I am saying though is that we're all the sums of our stories. We're every piece that happens to us. And every little thing that happens to us, we carry with us. And horrible shit happens. Bad things happen. And you want to know what? There isn't a big reason for it, right? But we carry those experiences with us. And when we survive something, it comes back to us, right? It surprises us. It helps us through something else. And I know this past year and a half, we've all been going through something. And for a lot of us, we might not have looked in the bathroom yet and assessed the damage to say like, okay, what has changed? What's different? But one day, what's happened in this past year and a half is going to come back to you and surprise you. Something you've learned, something you've survived will be there. And I'll be here ready to hear your story. Thank you.